The story of May 10th, 1945, does not begin in the sky. It begins on the ground at Kadena Airfield, just after sunrise, when 4 Marine pilots walked toward their Corsairs expecting nothing more than another routine patrol. They could not know that within hours, 2 of those aircraft would be forced back. One would be pushed beyond every limit ever printed in a flight manual, and one pilot would decide to use his own propeller as a weapon. Before the day ended, an act no engineer had designed for, and no pilot had ever attempted, would save American ships from one more wave of kamikaze attacks. The air over Okinawa that morning was clear and deceptively calm. Below, the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War was still unfolding. The Marines on the southern ridges were locked in a brutal fight against dug-in Japanese defenses, and the fleet offshore endured a kind of pressure no navy in history had faced: the relentless daily threat of suicide aircraft. Kamikaze waves rose from Kyushu like clockwork, guided by the same process that had taken American ships down for weeks. High-altitude reconnaissance planes called NICs. These twin-engine Kawasaki Ki-45s flew higher than most American fighters could reliably chase. Their crews photographed the fleet from thin, dangerous air, where engines strained and guns froze. Every photograph they carried meant new coordinates marked on Japanese targeting maps. Every transmission they sent meant another destroyer or carrier in jeopardy. VMF 312, the checkerboard squadron, knew exactly what those flights meant. They had already lost pilots in April. Everyone had. At 9:40 a.m., Captain Kenneth Reusser led his 4-ship division into the sky for a standard combat air patrol. First Lieutenant Robert R. Klingman flew as his wingman. Behind them, Captain Jim Cox and Second Lieutenant Frank Watson rounded out the division. The climb to patrol altitude was familiar. The pattern was familiar. Even the radio chatter felt like any other day. There was no reason to expect that within 2 hours, all 4 of them would be wrestling with the limits of their machines in air so thin that a single sharp movement could send any one of them into an unrecoverable spin. For almost an hour, the patrol was quiet. Then, at 10:37 a.m., a radar station on the ground reported a single enemy aircraft approaching from the north at 25,000 feet. The altitude told them everything. It was a NIC. It had already finished the first part of its reconnaissance run. If today followed the pattern of previous days, the aircraft would pass over the fleet again, then escape north with its photographs before American fighters could reach it. Reusser made his decision without hesitation. He ordered the division to climb. The Corsairs surged upward. At this stage of the war, the F-4U was one of the best climbing fighters in the Pacific, but even it had limits. The NIC was already high and climbing fast. Every minute that passed meant more thin air, more strain, more heat inside the engines. At 15,000 feet, Reusser ordered the division to drop their belly tanks. The metal cylinders tumbled away as the 4 fighters suddenly felt lighter and more eager to climb. But even with the reduced weight, the NIC still held the advantage. At 18,000 feet, Reusser issued an order no pilot forgets. They were to fire off their ammunition to shed weight. Klingman pressed the trigger and sent 2,000 rounds of .50 caliber fire into the ocean below. The long burst emptied nearly 700 pounds from his wings. The other pilots did the same. Tracers fell away like molten rain. It was a bizarre sight. 4 Marine fighters not firing at an enemy, but at gravity itself. Yet this was the only way to gain the altitude they needed before the NIC escaped. At 20,000 feet, The chase began to fracture. The air had grown thin enough that engines began to show signs of stress. Cox reported rough running. Watson soon followed. Their engines were overheating, their oil pressures fluctuating. The climb was killing their power plants. Reusser could not risk losing them. He ordered both men to abandon the chase and return to normal patrol altitude over the fleet. Only he and Klingman would continue. By now the Nick had completed its second pass. It was heading north. In minutes it would be too far, too high, and officially across the line of restricted pursuit. If it reached the safety of Japanese-controlled airspace with its photographs intact, the fleet would feel the consequences within a day. Reusser and Klingman pushed their throttles through the safety wires and into war emergency power. This was the kind of throttle setting reserved for moments pilots never wanted to face, where heat built faster than the engines could shed it, where every bolt and bearing was pushed past design limits. The Pratt & Whitney engines screamed under the strain, but the two Corsairs kept climbing. 30,000 feet, then 32, then 33. At each 1,000 feet gained, the world changed. The cockpit grew colder. The controls softened. The engines thinned the air through their superchargers as fast as they could. But the mixture was still starved. A mistake at this altitude wasn't simply a mistake. It was death. At 36,000 feet, the Corsairs met their published ceiling. On paper, this was the end of the flight. In practice, it was only the beginning. The Nick kept climbing, and the two Marines followed into air no one had ever intended their aircraft to enter. At 37,000 feet, Reusser and Klingman began closing the gap. The Nick's engines, though designed for high-altitude work, could not outrun the raw horsepower of the Corsairs forever. Not in thin air where every movement was harder and every advantage was smaller. At nearly 38,000 feet, Klingman realized there was almost nothing left in the airplane. The vibration was stronger. The engine gauges were parked in the red. His breath felt colder even through the oxygen mask. But ahead of him, the dark silhouette of the Nick grew larger. Reusser reached firing range first. The guns that had once been full now held only the remnants of the day's ammunition. He fired those last rounds straight into the Nick's right engine. Metal shredded. Flames bloomed. The Nick staggered but held itself in the sky, still moving, still transmitting, still dangerous. Reusser broke away. His guns were empty. It was now Klingman's fight. He lined up behind the Nick. 50 feet. Perfect distance. Tracers from the Nick's rear gunner slashed through the sky, punching into Klingman's right wing. He took a breath and pressed the trigger. Nothing happened. He pressed again. Still nothing. In the brutal cold of 38,000 feet, his guns had frozen solid. Behind him, his squadron. Below him, a fleet depending on this moment. Ahead of him, an enemy carrying the coordinates that could kill hundreds. And inside the cockpit of an aircraft pushed past every limit, Robert Klingman understood that if the mission was going to succeed, he would have to find another way. Klingman understood that if the mission was going to succeed, he would have to find another way. The Nick was still ahead of him, still flying on one burning engine, still capable of carrying its photographs north toward Japanese airspace, and he had nothing left that a fighter pilot was supposed to use. No ammunition, no working guns, no margin for error. He steadied his breathing and held position behind the enemy aircraft. The Nick continued to climb in slow, painful steps, losing power but stubbornly holding altitude. Its pilot certainly knew that 2 American fighters were behind him. He likely knew that one of them had already shot his engine out. What he did not know was that the second fighter's guns were frozen solid. From the Japanese perspective, this was the moment to run. But Klingman was not ready to let him go. He climbed just a little higher and felt the Corsair tremble in protest. The altitude was already beyond anything the aircraft had been designed to handle. Every inch gained felt like pushing into another world, one where the air barely existed, where engines grew tired, and where even small mistakes could turn into fatal spirals. He radioed Reusser, who flew slightly off to one side. His message was short. It wasn't dramatic. It was simply a statement of intent. He was going to ram the Knick's tail with his propeller. Reusser did not argue. There was no time to argue, and no better idea existed. The Knick had to be stopped. If Klingman chose to risk his own life, and the life of his Corsair, to cut the tail off the enemy aircraft, then that was what the moment demanded. Reusser shifted out of the line of fire, giving Klingman all the space he needed. Up ahead, the Knick's rear gunner realized what was happening. He swung his machine gun toward Klingman's Corsair and opened fire again. Tracers flashed past the cockpit. More holes punched through the fabric of Klingman's right wing, but he did not break away. His hands stayed steady on the stick. His eyes stayed locked on the target. He eased the Corsair into position above the Knick's tail. He pushed the nose down into a gentle dive. The distance started to close, slowly at first, then faster as gravity lent its help. The blurred disk of his 4-bladed propeller filled the lower edge of his windscreen. The Knick's tail rose into the center of the circle. 20 feet, 15 feet, 10. Then, impact. The Corsair shuddered as the propeller chewed into the Knick's rudder. Metal fragments burst outward and tore across the sky. A shower of aluminum scrap whirled past Klingman's canopy. Inside the Knick, the pilot fought to keep control as the vertical stabilizer twisted under the blow. The rudder was damaged. The aircraft dipped and rocked, but refused to die. It kept flying, still trailing smoke, still inching forward. Klingman pulled up. The Corsair vibrated violently now, each turn of the damaged prop sending shock through the entire airframe. He glanced at the curvature of the blades. One was bent, maybe 2, but the engine still turned them. As long as the engine ran, he had one more strike left in him. He climbed again, teeth clenched against the constant shaking. He aimed this time for the rear cockpit, the gunner's position. If he could remove the gunner, he could remove the Knick's final line of defense. The second strike had to count. Again he dove. This time, the angle was steeper. The speed built faster. The damaged prop wobbled in its rotation, threatening to tear itself away from the engine. But Klingman kept the nose steady and held his line. At the last moment, he saw the gunner turn. Through the shattered canopy glass of the Knick, Klingman could see his face. Shock, fear. Then the Corsair's propeller disc smashed into the rear cockpit. The canopy exploded. The gunner, his machine gun, and the entire mount were ripped from the aircraft in a single, wrenching motion. They vanished into the slipstream, flung into the empty sky. For a heartbeat, the Knick flew on with a jagged opening behind its pilot. Then its path wavered. The aircraft had lost its defender, but not yet its life. Klingman pulled away for the second time. Now the vibration was nearly unbearable. 2 blades were bent so sharply they almost touched the engine cowling. A third blade had lost several inches from its tip. Only one remained mostly intact. The entire propeller assembly had become a wildly unbalanced spinning mass that could fail at any moment. He had one chance left. The next hit would either finish the Nick once and for all, or it would destroy Klingman's aircraft, and possibly Klingman himself. He climbed once more, forcing the Corsair into position directly above the Nick. The Japanese pilot alone now must have realized the danger. He tried to jink left, then right, but at this altitude, with one engine gone and air so thin that the controls felt like wet paper, the Nick could not evade meaningfully. Klingman nosed over into his final dive. He aimed not at the rudder this time, nor at the rear cockpit, but at the base of the vertical stabilizer, the point where the tail joined the fuselage, the single weakest structural link on the entire aircraft. The Corsair rushed downward. The Nick filled Klingman's vision. Then the world turned into a scream of tearing metal. The propeller hit exactly where he aimed. The joint between tail and fuselage gave way under the blow. The entire tail assembly separated cleanly, shearing off as if sliced by a giant blade. For a moment the Nick seemed to hang motionless in the air. Then it pitched violently forward. Without a tail, it had no control surfaces left to stabilize it. The aircraft flipped nose first and began to tumble down through the sky, pieces breaking away as it fell. The pilot had no time to bail out. No parachute opened. The reconnaissance plane vanished into the long fall toward the Pacific, taking its photographs and its mission with it. Klingman had succeeded, but now he faced the consequences. His Corsair shook with a violence he had never felt. The third strike had twisted the propeller into shapes no propeller should ever take. The blades were nearly torn backward. The engine roared unevenly, fighting against the imbalance. Every second he remained at this power risked tearing the entire engine off its mounts. Klingman cut the throttle. The engine dropped toward idle. The shaking lessened, but did not disappear. The aircraft was still in danger. He eased the nose up, trying to regain level flight. The controls were soft and sluggish. At this altitude, a small mistake could still send him into a spin with no way out. But the horizon began to steady. He had survived the attack. Now he had to survive getting home. Behind him, Recon rejoined, calling over the radio but keeping his distance. He could see the damage. He knew Klingman was barely hanging on to the airplane. He also knew there were 70 miles of sky between them and Kadena, and that Klingman's engine was on borrowed time. Klingman took a slow breath. The mission was not over. Not yet. He pointed his crippled Corsair south and began the long descent home. Klingman pointed his crippled Corsair south and began the long descent toward Kadena. The enemy plane was gone, but the danger was not. In many ways, the mission had only shifted from combat to survival. The propeller was destroyed, 2 of its blades bent backward like broken arms, a third missing its tip entirely. The engine behind it had been pushed far beyond any safe limit for almost 2 due hours. Oil had thinned in the heat, metal had groaned, and every bearing inside the crankcase had suffered punishment no blueprint had ever imagined. At 38,000 feet, Klingman eased the throttle back further, coaxing the engine to idle. The vibration eased into something merely violent instead of catastrophic, but the Corsair still trembled hard enough to blur the horizon. He kept his movements smooth. Any sharp correction could trigger a stall. A stall at this altitude would be fatal. The thin air offered almost nothing to grip. Recovery would be impossible. Recon slipped back into formation on Klingman's right side. He said little over the radio. He didn't need to. A single glance told him everything. Klingman's propeller looked like it had been twisted by a giant hand. The tips of the bent blades glinted under the sun, showing bare metal where the paint had been stripped away. Bits of aluminum were still stuck to the edges from the Knick's shredded tail. If the propeller lost even a little more stability, it could shear off and cut into the fuselage, or tear the engine clean out of the airplane. But for now, it held together. Klingman began a slow descent. The Corsair was now part glider, part wounded animal. It did not fly so much as it endured. He eased it downward in a long, shallow path. The altitude dropped steadily. 36,000 feet, 34, 32. With every 1,000 feet lost, the air grew denser, the controls responded more reliably, and the airplane felt a little less fragile. He checked the fuel gauge. The reading was grim. During the 90-minute climb, he had burned fuel at a rate far beyond normal. War emergency power consumed it in hungry gulps. The needle hovered near empty, and he knew that was no illusion. The reserves he thought he had burned away long ago. The engine would not last. It was only a question of when. Still, he held on. He kept the Corsair trimmed for the most efficient glide possible. Kadena lay 70 miles ahead, a long stretch of ocean and land between him and safety. If the engine died too soon, he would have no choice but to ditch in the water. Klingman had already seen what happened to Corsairs that ditched at sea. They often flipped on contact. A pilot could be knocked out instantly or trapped beneath the water. Even a successful ditch left the pilot vulnerable until rescue boats or destroyers arrived. In the waters south of Okinawa, where Japanese aircraft still roamed, that was no guarantee of survival. 28,000 feet. The engine continued to turn, though with an uneven rhythm that felt wrong through the rudder pedals. The oil pressure needle drifted lower. Black smoke trailed from the cowling, thin at first, then darker. Klingman understood instantly. A seal had failed inside the engine. Oil was burning on hot metal surfaces. Without lubrication, the engine would seize soon. He kept gliding. There was nothing else to do. If the engine seized while windmilling, the propeller might lock in place. That would create enormous drag. The Corsair would lose range, but Klingman refused to panic. He adjusted his descent, keeping Kadena on the nose. Reusser stayed with him, pacing him on the right. When Klingman finally saw the faint shape of Okinawa ahead, a wave of relief washed over him, but only for a moment. Reaching the island was one thing. Reaching the runway was another. At 20,000 feet, Klingman calculated his glide path again. The angle was tight. He had little margin. If he came in too low, he would fall short. Too high, he would float beyond the threshold. And unlike other landings, he had no engine to correct mistakes. Every adjustment had to come from shallow dives or careful slips. Nothing more. The engine coughed. Then again. Klingman felt the vibration shift. He knew what was coming. He steadied the aircraft and nudged the nose slightly downward to preserve airspeed. At 10,000 feet, Kadena Airfield was in sight. The runway ran along the western coast, a strip of gray against the green of Okinawa. It was 3,600 feet long, more than enough for a healthy Corsair, but perhaps not enough for one gliding without power and carrying a damaged propeller. Klingman lowered the landing gear. The hydraulic system groaned. The right gear clunked down and locked. The nose gear followed. The left gear hesitated halfway. A red light glowed on the panel. He tried cycling the gear. Once, twice. The left gear refused to budge. Without full pressure, the hydraulics simply couldn't force it down. On a powered aircraft, he could try to yaw the plane, shake the gear loose, or even dive and pull up to use momentum. But with no engine, those options were deadly. One wrong motion could stall the aircraft. He would have to land with a partially extended gear. Ahead, Rooser radioed Kadena Tower. His message was calm, but the men on the ground understood what it meant. They cleared the runway at once. Crash trucks and ambulances rolled into position. Fire crews waited along the approach path, ready to race forward the moment Klingman touched down. At 5,000 feet, the engine coughed one final time. Then it quit completely. The propeller stopped dead, frozen in place like a twisted metal cross. For the first time since takeoff, the only sound inside the cockpit was the wind. Klingman trimmed for best glide speed, around 85 knots. He aimed the Corsair directly at the runway threshold. The aircraft floated gently downward, steady but unforgiving. 1 mile out, 1,000 feet. The left gear still hung halfway, refusing to lock. Klingman held the line. He refused to let the plane drift. A slip would cost altitude he could not spare. Any flare had to be perfect. Any bounce could collapse the left gear. He had one landing attempt, nothing more. At 200 feet, he realized he was slightly high. Not dangerously high, but high enough that the Corsair might float too far beyond the threshold. He eased the nose down. The descent increased. The runway widened beneath him. At 100 feet, everything narrowed into silence. He pulled back gently. The flare was shallow, controlled. The nose gear touched first, then the right main gear. A brief jolt ran through the fuselage. The left gear struck last, still showing a red light. But it held. Klingman stood on the brakes. The tires groaned. Smoke rose behind him. The Corsair slowed across the runway, rolling past the midpoint, then past the final marker. The airplane stopped, with only a few hundred feet remaining. Klingman exhaled. He had reached home. As he shut down the powerless systems, ground crew raced toward him, first staring at the bent propeller, then at the bullet holes, then at the oil streaks across the cowling. It didn't look like an airplane that should have flown at all. It looked like a machine pulled back from the brink, one that had survived only because its pilot refused to quit. The Corsair was done. But Klingman wasn't. When the Corsair finally stopped on the far end of the runway, the moment held a strange stillness. Klingman sat in the cockpit, hands trembling from exhaustion, adrenaline, and cold. The wind outside brushed past the canopy. It was almost quiet enough to forget that 2 hours earlier he had been fighting for his life at 38,000 feet. But the ground crew surrounding his aircraft brought him back to reality instantly. They ran to the plane, shouting to one another, pointing at the propeller, the shredded wing fabric, and the black streaks of burned oil running down the engine cowling. The mechanics had seen damaged Corsairs before. Flak bursts, bullet holes, blown cylinders, but nothing like this. 2 of the blades were bent backward so far they nearly touched the cowling. A 3rd blade was missing a full section from its tip. The 4th blade, though mostly intact, was cracked and twisted. The propeller no longer looked like a propeller. It looked like a mangled piece of metal dragged out of a wreckage. The maintenance chief stepped forward, a veteran Marine with decades of experience. He circled the aircraft twice in complete silence. He ran a hand along the engine cowling, looked at the bullet holes, and finally nodded to his crew. They all knew what the verdict was before he said a word. The Corsair was finished. The engine had been cooked. Every bearing inside was scored. The crankcase had run dry after the oil seal failed. The supercharger had swallowed more heat than it was ever meant to endure. The propeller hub was cracked beyond repair. Even the airframe showed signs of stress from the violent vibration during the final climb and the long glide home. There was no saving it. The plane had given everything it had, and then it had given more. Klingman climbed down from the cockpit, legs unsteady but steady enough to stand. His flight suit smelled faintly of burned oil and cold metal. Before he could even gather himself, intelligence officers moved toward him. Regulations required immediate debrief after combat, especially when the engagement was unusual, and nothing about today had been normal. They needed details. They needed clarity. And they needed to understand exactly how an American pilot had brought down a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft without firing a single round. They led Klingman to a small room near the flight line. His hands still shook. A corpsman offered him water. A flight surgeon checked his fingers for frostbite. But Klingman pushed the attention aside. He knew what the Navy needed. He began from the start. He described the climb. The drop tanks falling away. The long burst of fire into the ocean to shed weight. The moment Cox and Watson had to turn back. The push into emergency power. The thin air that nearly stole control of the aircraft. He explained how the Nick had completed its second pass, how it had turned north, how it had tried to escape behind altitude and time. Then he described reaching 38,000 feet, the point where the Corsair was no longer flying, so much as hanging on. He explained how Recon fired his last rounds and crippled the Nick's starboard engine. He described the tracers from the Japanese gunner punching holes into his own wing. When he reached the moment, he pressed the trigger, and nothing happened. The room fell silent. It was as if everyone could feel the cold, thin air freezing the guns in mid-flight. He told them how the idea formed, the decision to use the propeller instead of the machine guns. He did not describe it as heroic. He stated it plainly, the way pilots do when talking about split-second choices. The Nick had to be stopped. The fleet depended on it. His guns were gone. That left the propeller. Nothing more. He explained the first hit, the damage to the Nick's rudder, the violent shaking that followed. He described the second pass, the strike that tore the gunner and his weapon from the aircraft. Then he recounted the third attack, the one that separated the tail completely and sent the Nick tumbling toward the Pacific in pieces. One of the officers asked again, just to be sure. "You struck the tail with your propeller?" "Yes," Klingman said, 3 times. "And you stayed at altitude after the last strike?" He nodded once. The engine was nearly gone by then. "What was the altitude?" 38,000. Someone in the back of the room muttered a quiet curse. Even with oxygen equipment, even with proper engine tuning, that altitude was dangerous. No fighter pilot willingly stayed there. And yet Klingman had fought there, maneuvered there, and survived there with a propeller that looked ready to tear loose at any moment. When the debrief ended, Klingman was dismissed long enough to walk back toward his squadron's tents. Recon met him halfway. He clapped Klingman on the shoulder. No speeches, no dramatic praise, just the gesture of a man who knew exactly what it meant to risk everything in the thin air above a battlefield. Within hours, the kill was confirmed. Recon's witness account matched Klingman's. Radar had tracked the engagement. Wreckage sightings from ships below supported the claim. One Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick, destroyed at extreme altitude. No survivors, no photographs recovered, no transmissions sent back to Japanese commanders. The implications were immediate. That reconnaissance flight would not feed the next kamikaze wave. Those ships would not burn the following day. And Marine Fighter Squadron 312 had witnessed something unprecedented. Word spread quickly through the airfield. Pilots gathered around the wrecked Corsair, shaking their heads as they examined the propeller. Mechanics pointed out each twisted blade. The news traveled down the flight line in minutes. Klingman had rammed the enemy with his propeller and lived. That evening, the squadron commander filed the recommendation for Klingman's Navy Cross. It was not a decoration given lightly. It required extraordinary heroism, complete disregard for personal safety, and a direct impact on the success of the mission. Klingman's report checked every box. The recommendation also noted the most important fact. His actions likely prevented another deadly kamikaze attack on the American fleet. By dusk, the adrenaline that had carried Klingman through the day began to fade. He lay on a simple cot under the canvas roof of the squadron tent, staring up at the dim light and replaying the events in his mind. The propeller strikes, the shaking engine, the desperate glide, and the landing that almost wasn't. He felt the cold in his fingers again, remembering how the oxygen mask had pressed tight against his face. But the war didn't pause for long. 2 days later, on May 12th, Klingman was back in the cockpit. The mission that day was routine. The skies were quiet, but fate had one more test prepared for him. His aircraft developed a hydraulic failure on approach. The landing gear refused to lower. With no choice left, Klingman bailed out over the water. He hit the ocean hard, then floated for 30 minutes until a destroyer hauled him aboard. He returned to Kadena that same night. The next morning, he was flying again. But the story of May 10th stayed with him, and with everyone who heard it. It became more than an after-action report. It became a piece of living legend, a reminder of what pilots sometimes had to do when circumstances stripped away everything familiar, leaving only courage, instinct, and the will to finish the mission. Klingman had flown 80 combat missions by the end of the Okinawa campaign. None would be remembered the way this one was. None would ever match the moment when, high above the Pacific, he turned a fighter plane into a blade and cut an enemy from the sky. By the time the story of May 10th spread across Kadena Airfield, many pilots began asking the same question. Who exactly was Robert R. Klingman? Most of them knew him only as a calm presence in the ready tent and a steady hand in the air. But the path that brought him to the cockpit of a Corsair had started long before the Pacific War. In a place far removed from the steel decks of carriers and the thin air above Okinawa, Klingman was born on January 12, 1917, in the small farming town of Binger, Oklahoma. He was one of 9 children, part of a generation shaped by hardship, even before the Great Depression arrived. Oklahoma's fields offered work, but not stability. When the droughts came, families like the Klingmans tightened their belts and did what they could. As a teenager, Robert carried the weight of responsibility early. He was quiet, dependable, and often found himself helping his father with farm chores before the sun reached the horizon. But the family had trouble keeping enough food on the table. When the federal government offered civilian military training programs in 1934, programs that promised 30 days of meals, clothing, and discipline, his parents encouraged him to go. It wasn't military service. It was survival. During that month at Fort Sill, with a simple cot, a clean uniform, and regular meals, something changed for Robert. He discovered that he liked the structure, the predictability, the sense of purpose. He liked knowing that effort led somewhere. When he returned home, the farm seemed smaller, somehow narrower than before. 6 months later, at 17, he enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. His first Marine assignment, however, was nothing like what he would later become known for. After basic training at Paris Island, he was sent to Marine Barracks in Washington, D.C. As part of the ceremonial detachment, he played drums for official events, parades, and military funerals. It was quiet work, precise and disciplined, but far from the combat world he would one day inhabit. Still, he stayed focused, sending much of his pay back home to help his family. By 1938, his enlistment ended, and he returned to Oklahoma, unsure of what came next. Jobs were scarce. The country was still clawing its way out of the Depression. He opened a small burger cafe, a humble business built on hope more than profit. It survived, but only barely. Long hours and thin earnings forced him to consider something better. In 1940, with war already raging in Europe, his older brother gave him blunt advice. "The Navy will give you more than this cafe ever will." Robert listened. He enlisted again, this time with the Navy, and reported for duty aboard the battleship USS Tennessee as an aviation mechanic. He adapted quickly. He liked engines. He liked machines that obeyed rules. And he knew how to work until a task was done. Promotions followed, but his timing collided with history. In late 1941, he was sent to San Diego for additional training on aircraft operations. It was supposed to be temporary. On December 7th, while he was still learning the finer points of carrier qualification, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. USS Tennessee, the ship he had served on only months earlier, took 2 bomb hits and burned in the chaos. That morning changed the course of his life. He finished his training with renewed focus, graduated, and was selected for a program he hadn't dared hope for, Aviation Cadet School. The Navy needed pilots. The Marine Corps needed pilots, and men with mechanical experience, discipline, and maturity were suddenly in high demand. But Robert was 25, older than most cadets. Many were barely 19, fresh from high school with quick reflexes and no responsibilities. He knew he would have to work twice as hard to keep up. And he did. In pre-flight courses, he studied relentlessly, placing in the top 10% of his class. In flight school at Naval Air Station Corpus Christi, he learned how to navigate, how to trust instruments, how to think through emergencies instead of reacting blindly. The first time he took the controls of a trainer aircraft, an instructor later said, "He flew like a man who had been waiting for that moment his entire life." In early 1944, he earned his wings and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps. His next stop was Marine Fighter Squadron 312, VMF 312, the Checkerboards. Their aircraft, the Chance Vought F-4U Corsair. The Corsair was powerful, fast, and unforgiving. It had a massive engine, a long nose, and a habit of bouncing on carrier decks. The Navy preferred the more forgiving Hellcat for carrier duty. The Marines took the Corsair and learned to tame it on land. Training at Paris Island was intense. The squadron learned air-to-air gunnery, ground attack, navigation over open water, and the art of finding a target in a sky full of chaos. Klingman was steady. Not the flashiest pilot, not the most aggressive, but the one who hit his marks and kept his composure. He impressed instructors with his reliability and his instinct for engine behavior. When something didn't sound right in the Corsair, Robert knew before anyone else. By the time the Checkerboards shipped out in March 1945, their destination was one of the most dangerous assignments of the war, Okinawa. They arrived at Kadena Airfield just as the invasion force was settling in. Japanese defenders still held the high ground, artillery shells still fell, and kamikaze pilots were beginning their most concentrated assault of the war. From the moment he flew his first combat mission on April 8th, Klingman saw the reality of Okinawa. Smoke rising from burning ships, radio calls from destroyers taking hits, clouds of black flak drifting across the sky from desperate anti-aircraft batteries, Each sortie was a reminder that the margin between safety and disaster was razor thin. He shot down his first enemy aircraft 2 days later, an aggressive Zero rushing toward the American picket line. His second came 4 days after that. His third, a low-flying reconnaissance plane, followed soon after. But the missions were relentless. He flew nearly every day, sometimes twice, on rare days, 3 times. By early May, Klingman had already logged 43 combat flights. He understood the terrain, the patterns, and the enemy tactics. And like every pilot at Kadena, he knew about the high-altitude nicks. He had watched them from below, dark specks moving far above the fleet. He had heard the anger in the voices of destroyer captains when they reported incoming kamikazes. He had seen the aftermath, burned steel, black water, and sailors pulled from the wreckage. So when the radar warning came on May 10th, and Reusser ordered the division to climb, Klingman felt something sharpen inside him. Not fear, not excitement, just purpose. The mission that day would demand everything he had learned, from the dust fields of Oklahoma, to the parade grounds of Washington, to the engines of the Tennessee, to the cockpit of a Corsair. But he did not know then that the next 2 hours would carve his name permanently into the history of marine aviation. In the days that followed the mission of May 10th, Kadena Airfield seemed to move with a different energy. Pilots walked past Klingman's ruined Corsair as if it were a monument. Mechanics shook their heads each time they passed the bent propeller blades. The air seemed to carry the story from tent to tent, retold by men who had been there and men who wished they had. No one could quite understand how the aircraft had stayed together, or how Klingman had stayed alive inside it. But the war did not pause for amazement. The Battle of Okinawa raged on, day after day, and every pilot knew that the next mission could be their last. Klingman was back in the air 2 days after his emergency landing, because that was simply what the job required. And even when he bailed out over the ocean after a hydraulic failure on May 12th, he climbed into another Corsair the very next morning, without hesitation. Still, the story of May 10th had slipped into flight logs, intelligence briefings, and the conversations of senior officers across the airfield. By the end of the month, an official report had reached the desk of the commanding general. The recommendation was clear. First Lieutenant Robert R. Klingman was to receive the Navy Cross, the second highest decoration awarded for heroism in combat. When the squadron commander gathered the checkerboards to deliver the news, the reaction was quiet, almost solemn. Pilots in combat units rarely cheered. They nodded to each other, a gesture of respect, understanding what the medal meant and what it cost to earn it. The citation was read aloud a few days later. The words were formal, shaped by military tradition, but the meaning behind them carried the weight of what every man in the squadron already knew. The Navy Cross recognized courage above and beyond the call of duty. But it also recognized something less visible. The moment when Klingman accepted that his airplane would be sacrificed, and possibly his life as well, because the mission demanded it. The citation detailed the impossible altitude, the frozen guns, and the 3 deliberate propeller strikes. It emphasized that Klingman's actions prevented Japanese reconnaissance photographs from reaching enemy commanders, helping to disrupt kamikaze planning at a critical phase of the Okinawa campaign. And it noted, without embellishment, that his safe return was nothing short of extraordinary. For Klingman, the medal was both an honor and a reminder. He had not acted for recognition. He had acted because there was no other choice. But now, with the worst of the fighting still ahead, he carried the weight of becoming something that pilots rarely want to become: a symbol. By late May, kamikaze attacks were reaching their peak intensity. The Japanese launched more suicide missions against the fleet at Okinawa than in any other battle of the war. Destroyers on picket stations endured constant strain, listening for every radar return and every distant engine. Corsair pilots like Klingman flew intercept after intercept, knowing each attack they broke up saved sailors below. The Nicks continued to appear, though rarely as high as the one Klingman had fought. After the loss on May 10th, Japanese crews seemed more cautious, and fewer recon flights dared climb into the thin air where American persistence and desperation had proven deadly. Still, the checkerboards remained alert. Their readiness came not only from training, but from experience, and Robert Klingman now embodied that experience more than anyone on the field. Through the rest of May and June, Klingman flew mission after mission, ground support runs, combat air patrols, intercepts. Sometimes hours passed without seeing the enemy. Other times the sky filled with smoke and metal, and he returned to Kadena with new bullet holes stitched across his aircraft. The weariness showed, not in his flying, but in the tired lines around his eyes each night at the briefing tent. The Battle of Okinawa stretched into its final weeks. Fighting on the ground grew fiercer as Japanese forces retreated into a shrinking defensive pocket in the south. Rain turned hillsides into mud. Casualties mounted on both sides. At sea, the fleet absorbed blow after blow. Destroyers were sunk. Carriers were damaged. Hundreds of sailors died. The cost of the campaign weighed on everyone. Yet the pilots kept flying. On June 22nd, the island was finally declared secure. It had taken 82 days, the longest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. Marine aircraft at Kadena, including the checkerboards, continued flying missions even after the formal announcement. Some patrolled for remaining enemy aircraft. Others performed reconnaissance or stood ready for new operations because no one knew what the next months would bring. By the time combat flights tapered off, Klingman had flown 78 missions in just over 2 months. The sheer pace spoke to the intensity of the Okinawa campaign and the strain it placed on every airman involved. Yet his most defining mission remained the one that began at 9:40 a.m. on May 10th. One climb, one decision, one impossible battle at nearly 40,000 feet. When the squadron finally prepared to rotate back to the United States, Klingman packed his gear quietly. He had grown older in ways he didn't speak about. War aged a man quickly, and Okinawa aged him even more. But the things he carried, experience, instinct, calm under pressure, would guide him through the years ahead. In August, the war ended. Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Pacific, after so many years of fire, finally grew silent. But for Klingman, the service did not end. The Marine Corps needed experienced pilots, and he was one of the few who had not only survived Okinawa, but learned from it. In the months after Japan's surrender, he served with occupation forces before returning to the United States. His Navy Cross became known across Marine aviation circles. Young pilots listened to the story with equal parts disbelief and admiration. Instructors referenced it during high-altitude training, reminding cadets that machines could exceed their limits if the pilot's resolve was strong enough. But Klingman never spoke about the mission with pride or drama. To him, it was simple. The job needed doing, and he had found a way. Years later, when he would reflect on the war, he seldom mentioned the medals or the victories. What he remembered were the faces, his squadron mates, the men he trusted with his life every time he strapped himself into a cockpit. Some had made it home. Some never had the chance. But on May 10th, he had fought for all of them. And that fight, high above the Pacific, would define his name long after the war ended. When Robert Klingman returned to the United States after the war, he was 28 years old. He had flown 78 combat missions, bailed out twice, survived an engine failure at 3,000 feet, and fought an enemy aircraft with nothing but the spinning disk of his propeller. But the world he came home to was a gentler place. Quiet streets, familiar voices, and the soft edges of a life that felt impossibly far from the chaos of Okinawa. He married soon after returning. His wife's name was Jackie Cochran, not the famous woman aviator, but a different woman with the same name, a coincidence that amused their friends but meant little to them. What mattered was that she had waited for him through the war, sending letters, holding hope, and keeping faith. When they married, she wore a wedding dress crafted from the silk of the parachute he had used when he bailed out on May 12th. The white fabric, once meant to save his life, now symbolized the beginning of a new one. But the Navy Cross pinned to his chest didn't mark the end of his service. The Marine Corps needed experienced pilots more than ever. Many wartime aviators left the service when peace came, but Klingman stayed. The cockpit felt like home. The sky still called him, and he knew that the world, even in peace, was always one heartbeat away from conflict. Throughout the late 1940s, he trained new pilots, sharing lessons shaped by real danger rather than textbooks. He taught them how to feel the engine through the airframe, how to sense the moment when altitude became a threat, and how discipline mattered more than instinct when the margin between survival and disaster narrowed. Young Marines listened to him with respect. They knew he wasn't speaking from theory. He was speaking from a day in 1945 when he had flown beyond reason and come back alive. Then, in June 1950, the Korean War began. North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel, and the United Nations called for military assistance. The United States answered. The Marine Corps mobilized, and Robert Klingman, older now, steadier, and seasoned by experience, was among those called to serve again. This time, he did not fly a fighter. Instead, he deployed as a forward air controller with the 1st Marine Division. His job was no less dangerous and no less vital. Forward air controllers went where the infantry went. They walked with the riflemen, climbed the hills, crossed the valleys, and marked targets for the jets and prop-driven aircraft circling above. Their radios were lifelines. Their judgment decided whether an airstrike saved Marines or put them in greater danger. Klingman carried his radio across Korea's harsh terrain, often within yards of enemy positions. He directed close air support in battles where weather, distance, and chaos made precision difficult, and he earned another air medal for his work. But medals mattered less than the trust of the men around him. The riflemen who watched him mark targets under fire, the pilots who listened to his voice cut through static and gunfire, and the commanders who relied on his calm under pressure. He served in Korea for more than a year. When he returned home, he continued his career with the same quiet resolve he had shown from the beginning. His promotions came steadily. His responsibilities grew. And as the Marine Corps entered the jet age, Klingman adapted, learning new systems and supporting new generations of pilots. By the early 1960s, he had risen to the rank of lieutenant colonel. Few men in the service had a trajectory like his. A teenager from Oklahoma who had gone to Fort Sill for food and clothing. A ceremonial drummer in Washington, a mechanic aboard USS Tennessee, a fighter pilot over Okinawa, and a combat controller in Korea. 32 years of service, 3 major eras of aviation, 2 wars. He retired from the Marine Corps in 1966 at the age of 49. But retirement did not mean grounding. Klingman moved to Kihei on the island of Maui in Hawaii, a place where the air was warm, the skies clear, and the Pacific spread wide in every direction. He earned his civilian pilot's license and flew small aircraft around the islands. Even after everything he had seen, he still loved being in the air. He still found peace in the hum of an engine, the steady rise of altitude, and the wide silence above the ocean. He rarely spoke about May 10th, 1945. His family knew the general shape of the story, but not the details. He did not relive it at dinner tables or gatherings. When veterans spoke about their most dangerous moments, he listened politely, nodded, and offered a few words. But he seldom spoke about the day when he had used a propeller as a weapon. To him, it had been a choice made in the moment, nothing more. A necessary decision, a mission completed. The full story only came to light through historians, squadron records, and the testimony of men like Kenneth Roycer, who had witnessed every second of the climb that morning. Military analysts later studied Klingman's attack in detail. They concluded that no other American pilot in World War II had ever made 3 deliberate propeller strikes at such altitude and survived. In fact, very few pilots anywhere had attempted anything similar. Most ramming attacks ended in the destruction of both aircraft. Klingman's precision and the strength of the Corsair itself made the outcome unique. He lived quietly for decades, enjoying the simple rhythm of island life, flying when he pleased, visiting family, and watching the Marine Corps evolve into a force shaped by jet aircraft and global commitments. His grandchildren grew up hearing that their grandfather had flown in the war, but only later did they understand how extraordinary that statement really was. On July 6, 2004, Robert R. Klingman passed away in Kihei at the age of 87, following complications from a stroke. His wife, children, and grandchildren survived him. He was laid to rest at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. Rifle volleys cracked through the air. A flag draped his coffin. The final notes of taps rose into the quiet sky, the same sky he had once fought through, climbed through, and survived against all odds. His grave marker lists his decorations plainly: Navy Cross, Distinguished Flying Cross, Air Medal with Gold Star. Simple words for a complex life. But the true legacy of Robert Klingman remains in the story that began at Kadena Airfield and climbed into the freezing heights above Okinawa. It lives on in the lessons he taught young pilots, in the missions he helped guide in Korea, and in the courage he showed when he turned a propeller into a blade to save the men in the fleet below. History remembers wars through dates, strategies, and turning points. But sometimes history is shaped by a single decision made in a cockpit, by a pilot who refuses to let the mission fail, and by courage found in the thin, dangerous air where engines falter and guns freeze. On May 10th, 1945, at 38,000 feet, Robert R. Klingman made such a decision. And because he did, American ships survived another day. Because he did, a legend was born. And because he did, his name will not be forgotten.